This session is about fellowship and worship, and from the off I want to deal with fellowship and worship separately. In regards to fellowship, I just have a simple question. When do we receive fellowship from our fellow sisters and brothers? When do we listen to and share stories of our faith journeys and support one another, care for one another and pray with one another? That's the first bit, fellowship. I invite us to think about that because I think it's something much easily talked about and much harder to do in practice. The next bit of the session I want to talk about is worship, and I want to separate that down into gathered and dispersed. Gathered is usually on a Sunday, and as a minister I will ring up a steward of a new congregation and say, what do you do? And the answer is usually, the normal thing. And the remainder of the phone call is then me trying to unpick exactly what that congregation does and what they consider as normal. And I think it's important that as a congregation we are aware of what we do and how we do it and why we do it. And so often I'll come to a congregation and I'll say, okay, so you do it like that, why? And the usual response, unfortunately, is, well, we've always done it that way. And maybe there's a very good reason why they've done it that way, and that's fantastic. But I guess I just always want to challenge and say, well, why do you do it that way? Why don't you do it differently? At this point I want to use the word liturgy, but I'm aware that when we use the word liturgy it's often assumed to be the written liturgy, the written down stuff, the responses and all that kind of stuff. But actually liturgy in the broader sense covers all of these elements of worship, all of the prayers, the songs, the reading of the Bible, when the offering is, when the notices are, all those elements form the chapel's liturgy. And so I invite us today to think about what do we do in each of those elements, why do we do them a certain way, and how they may differ from other chapels and churches. And so that is the gathered element of worship. Now I want to talk about the dispersed moments of worship, that during the week, when do we have time out just to worship God? Do we have time out to worship God? Are there quiet moments or loud moments when we put on Christian TV or listen to music, Christian music in the week? And I guess I want to challenge us again to think about, does that line up with our Sunday worship, or is that different? Are they juxtaposed or are they very alike? Are there times when our Sunday worship looks very differently from the stuff that we do during the week? I wonder, are we the sort of person that likes to challenge ourselves during worship, to try new things, to try new styles, to try songs that are not out of our usual song list? I invite us that actually when we're thinking about worshipping midweek, when we're maybe doing it on our own or with other people, how much of that do we bring to our Sunday morning service? Is it similar or is it different? Because I guess I want to challenge us to think about that if we are not willing as individuals to try new things, to explore new worship leaders, new resources, then we're going to also struggle as a congregation as we gather to try new things as well. And so today I just encourage us and challenge us to think about our fellowship and worship. I realise we've talked a lot about worship and not so much about fellowship. I'd like to share a story with you, which I imagine is a borrowed story from my granddad's preaching days. It was a story about a pastoral leader going to visit a church member that they'd not seen at church for quite some time. They go around and they're welcomed in. Just before they sit down, the member stokes the fire and a coal rolls out. Still keeps on the hearth, it's fine. But then the conversation carries on, moves on, and there's concern. But the member's there saying, look, I'm fine. I'm taking over fine. I don't really need to gather to worship. And as the conversation comes to a close, the pastoral visitor just stops for a moment and just makes note and comments about the the coal. It says, look, yeah, as we've been talking, this coal's been doing all right, but it's starting to go out. And just as it's important for that coal to keep in with the rest of the fire, to keep burning, that one piece of coal also helps the rest of the fire to keep going too. And so the church member was quite taken by that. And just as the pastoral leader's going, he stops out the door and says, I'll see you on Sunday. It's interesting when we talk about fellowship, it's good to think about keeping each other going. I think there's also something there about looking after each other socially, being alongside like-minded people. I think there's also something there about enabling an atmosphere where we can talk about spiritual stuff too. I don't just mean kind of this, that or the other, but I mean, whether we're having a good week or not, whether we've been able to pray or not, whether we've been challenged by what we've been reading or not. And I think there's also something about the social element that shouldn't be underplayed either. With Jesus' ministry, it wasn't just about the spiritual stuff. There was a physical, practical element at times too, about physically feeding people, healing people, making them whole. I wonder, how are we, as individuals, as groups, as congregations, at looking out for one another, feeding one another? I invite us today to think about fellowship and worship, and whether we're getting the right balance of both. Whether we're getting the right balance of spiritually looking out for one another, as well as just being there for people during the storms of their lives.